The wind that rolled across the Wyoming plains that morning was sharp enough to cut through bone. It howled against the walls of the old homestead like a restless ghost, rattling shutters and whispering through the cracks where the cold crept in. Inside, a single candle burned low, its flame trembling as though afraid to be the last light in a world gone dark. Clara Dawson sat beside the iron bed, clutching the still hand of her husband, Thomas. His skin was cold, his face pale, and his chest had not risen for hours. The war had taken the best of him long before death came. He'd come home with lungs that wheezed like a broken bellows, and each winter had stolen more breath until the last one stole it all. Clara sat there in silence, her eyes red and raw, her newborn swaddled in her arm. The baby made a soft sound, not quite a cry, more a sigh, as though sensing that something sacred had just left the room. Outside, the world carried on. Horses whinnied in the barn. The windmill groaned. Somewhere beyond the hills, snow clouds were gathering, heavy and gray. Clara's thoughts were numb. Grief hadn't settled in yet. There was only a hollow stillness, a strange calm that came when a person had cried all they could. Thomas had been her whole world, her protector, her laughter, her reason to believe this wild land could be home. Now, sitting beside his body, she felt the walls of that world crumble, leaving only the sound of the wind and the faint heartbeat of the child in her arms. She named him Samuel, after Thomas's grandfather, though she said it aloud to no one. The next day brought more cold, and with it, Thomas's family. His mother arrived in a black shawl that flapped like a crow's wing in the wind, and his two brothers rode in behind her, their faces hard and unreadable. Clara hoped for comfort, maybe even a kind word. Instead, she found judgment waiting for her at the door. "You've got no claim here," his eldest brother, Edwin, said before she could even speak. "This house, this land, they're Dawson property. You're not blood." Clara's lips parted, her voice small. "I'm his wife. I bore his son." Edwin's gaze swept over her, lingering on the crying infant in her arms. "You bore a mouth to feed," he said flatly. "That's all." His mother's silence was worse. She stood in the doorway like stone, eyes cold as winter water. Clara knew then that there would be no mercy, no family left for her. She tried to reason, tried to plead for time, just a few weeks, until the snow eased and she could find work, but the men loaded Thomas's body into a wagon before she could finish her sentence. They buried him without ceremony at the edge of the field where the snow had not yet hardened. Clara watched from a distance, clutching Samuel close beneath her shawl, her tears freezing before they reached her chin. When the grave was filled, Edwin climbed back into the wagon and said, "You best be gone by sundown." By dusk, she stood in the doorway of the only home she'd known for 5 years, looking back one last time. Her meager belongings fit into a single sack, a spare dress, a locket, and the quilt she'd sewn the summer before. She wrapped Samuel tightly and stepped out into the wind. The horizon stretched wide and empty, gold fading into violet as night came on. Behind her, the Dawsons' lantern lights flickered in the windows like eyes that refused to blink. Ahead lay miles of prairie and snow. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay. She walked until her legs trembled, following the faint outline of a wagon trail that wound through the valley. The cold bit her cheeks, turned her breath to frost. Each step was an act of will, driven by the soft weight of the baby pressed to her chest. She whispered to him as she walked. Small words meant more for herself than for him. "We'll find a place, Sam, somewhere warm, somewhere kind." When the moon rose, pale and thin as a blade, she saw the first sign of life, a lantern bobbing in the distance, hanging from a post outside a ranch gate. The sign read, "Red Willow Ranch." Beyond it, she could make out the silhouette of barns and a sprawling farmhouse lit by lamplight. She hesitated. Pride told her to keep walking, to find her own way. But the wind howled and the baby stirred, and she knew pride would freeze them both before dawn. She pushed through the gate and walked up the long dirt path, her boots sinking into the snow. The door opened before she reached it. A tall man stood there, a rifle in one hand, lamplight catching the worn brim of his hat. His eyes narrowed at the sight of her, a woman half frozen, clutching a crying infant. "Ma'am," he said cautiously, lowering the rifle but not relaxing. "You lost?" Clara's voice cracked as she tried to speak. "My husband's gone. His family, they turned me out. Please, Her throat closed around the words. The man's jaw tightened. He stepped aside and gestured her in. "You'd better come inside before that baby freezes." She hesitated, then stepped over the threshold. The warmth hit her like a miracle, the scent of coffee, the soft crackle of a fire. The man set the rifle by the wall and poured a tin cup of water, handing it to her. His voice was low, steady. "Name's Luke Bennett. This here's my ranch." Clara nodded weakly. "Clara Dawson." Luke glanced toward the baby, who had begun to quiet under the warmth. "And the little one?" "Samuel." Something flickered in Luke's expression, something softer, though fleeting. He knelt beside the fire, stirring the coals. "You can rest here tonight, Mrs. Dawson. We'll figure the rest in the morning." Clara wanted to thank him, but exhaustion swallowed her words. She sank into the chair by the fire, clutching Samuel close. For the first time in days, her body stopped trembling. Outside, the wind howled and snow began to fall. Thick and silent, and though she didn't know it yet, that ranch, that man with kind eyes and a lonely heart, would become the place where grief would turn, slowly, into something new. When Clara woke the next morning, she wasn't sure at first where she was. For a brief, fragile moment, she thought she'd dreamed it all. The cold, the death, the long walk through the dark. But then she felt the soft weight of Samuel against her chest, heard the faint hiss of the fire in the hearth, and remembered. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, catching in the motes of dust that drifted lazily through the warm room. She was in a stranger's home, though, in that moment, it felt safer than anywhere she'd been in weeks. Luke Bennett was already awake. She could hear him moving about somewhere beyond the small parlor, boots scraping against wood, a kettle clattering. The air smelled of coffee and bacon grease. Clara eased out of the chair, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs, and laid Samuel gently in the cradle that someone, Luke, she supposed, had placed by the fire during the night. It was rough-hewn but sturdy, with a folded quilt inside. She brushed her hand over it, noticing the careful stitches. Whoever Luke Bennett was, he had a gentler side beneath his weathered exterior. When she stepped into the kitchen, he looked up from the stove. The morning light fell across him, catching the dusting of flour on his sleeve and the faint stubble on his jaw. He wasn't a young man, perhaps in his mid-30s, but his face held a quiet strength, the kind built from long years of working land and losing things that couldn't be kept. His eyes, though, gray-blue like the morning sky, softened when they met hers. "Mornin', Mrs. Dawson," he said, tipping his hat slightly even though it sat on the table beside him. "You sleep at all?" Clara managed a small nod. "Some." Her voice still rasped from the cold. "Good. There's coffee, and I fried some ham. Ain't much, but it'll warm you." She murmured thanks and took the plate he handed her. The first bite nearly made her cry, not because it was fine food, but because it was the first warm thing she'd had in days. Luke didn't speak much as she ate. He poured himself a cup of coffee, leaned against the counter, and watched the snow drift past the window. When she'd finished, he set down his mug and said quietly, "You can stay here for a spell. Got a spare room. I ain't much for company, but I don't turn folks out in winter." Clara blinked. I don't want to trouble you. I'll find work when the road's clear." He shook his head. "You've got a newborn and no place to go. That's trouble enough. Don't make it worse by freezing half to death." There was no pity in his tone, only plain, steady kindness. It disarmed her more than harshness would have. She nodded, lowering her gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. I'll earn my keep, I promise." "You can start by resting," he said. "Then maybe help with cooking when you're fit. I got hands for the ranch work, but no one for the house." And so, for the first time since Thomas's death, Clara had a place to breathe. Days passed quietly at Red Willow Ranch. Snow fell for a week straight, laying thick over the fences and roofs, muting the world into stillness. Luke kept mostly to himself, tending cattle and mending equipment in the barn. But he always made sure there was wood by the fire and food on the table. Clara did what she could, washing dishes, mending shirts, caring for Samuel. The child grew stronger by the day, his cheeks pink and his cries louder, echoing through the quiet rooms. Sometimes, when she rocked him to sleep by the fire, she caught Luke glancing her way, something unspoken flickering in his expression. One evening, after another long day of snow, she found him in the barn. He was brushing down his horse, a tall chestnut mare with a white blaze, and humming softly under his breath. The tune was old and mournful, something that stirred the ache in her chest. She lingered by the doorway. "That song," she said softly. "My husband used to hum it when he thought I wasn't listening." Luke looked up, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "It's one my father taught me. Used to sing it to the herd when storms came in." There was silence between them, filled only by the sound of the horse's breathing and the creak of leather. Clara stepped closer, running her hand along the mare's neck. "She's beautiful. Her name's Mercy," he said. "Found her half-starved near the river 2 winters back. Thought she wouldn't make it, but she did." Clara met his eyes then, and for a heartbeat, something passed between them, an understanding deeper than words. They were both survivors of a kind, both people who'd lost and still found reason to go on. When she turned to go, Luke spoke quietly. "Clara." She stopped. It was the first time he'd said her name. "You don't have to rush to figure things out," he said. "You're safe here. As long as you need." Her throat tightened. She wanted to say thank you, but all that came out was a nod before she slipped back toward the house, her heart beating faster than it had in months. That night, as the fire crackled low, she sat with Samuel asleep in her arms and thought of Luke's voice, the steady calm in it. The world had taken everything she'd known, her husband, her home, her future. Yet here, in this small ranch house tucked beneath the falling snow, something fragile was beginning to grow. Hope, maybe, or the faint outline of a life not yet lost. By the end of that week, the storm eased. The world outside glittered under a pale winter sun. Clara stood on the porch wrapped in her shawl, watching Luke ride out across the frozen fields to check the herd. His figure moved steady against the white horizon, a lone rider in a vast, endless world. She felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest. Admiration, yes, but something gentler too. Something that scared her, though she couldn't name it yet. Inside, Samuel stirred and began to cry. Clara turned back, smiling faintly as she lifted him. "Hush, little one," she whispered. "It's all right now. We're safe." And for the first time in a long while, she believed it. As the days stretched into weeks, Red Willow Ranch began to feel less like a shelter from the storm and more like a home. The snow still came now and then, blanketing the land in white silence. But inside the house there was warmth, the steady crackle of the fire, the smell of bread baking, the soft gurgles of Samuel as he learned to smile. Clara's hands, once raw and trembling, grew strong again. She mended torn coats, milked the cow, even learned to hitch a wagon with Luke's quiet guidance. Each day she discovered something new, not just about ranch life, but about herself. She'd thought widowhood would leave her hollow, a ghost among the living. Yet out here, beneath the wide sky, she felt something stirring again. A sense of purpose, of belonging. Luke was a man of few words, but his silence never felt empty. He spoke when he needed to, and when he did, every word seemed to matter. He taught her how to read weather by the clouds, how to split kindling without splinters, how to listen for the soft sounds that meant a storm was coming. Clara learned that his father had built this ranch from nothing, a patch of wilderness carved into a life, but both his parents had died young, leaving him with land and loneliness in equal measure. He'd had hands working for him once, a small crew of cowboys, but over the years most had drifted away to bigger outfits farther south. Now, only Luke remained to tend the place through each passing season. Sometimes, Clara caught glimpses of the man beneath the calm, a quiet sadness in his eyes when he thought no one watched. A way his hand lingered on the doorframe when he came in from the cold, as though remembering who used to stand there waiting. She didn't pry, but she listened, not just with her ears, but with the kind of stillness born from understanding loss. One evening, when Samuel had fallen asleep and the wind howled softly outside, Luke sat across from her at the fire and spoke, his voice low. "I was married once," he said, eyes fixed on the flames. "Her name was Anna. We built this place together. Thought we'd fill it with laughter one day." He paused, his jaw tightening. Then fever came through the valley. Took her in 3 days. Clara's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to share something so raw. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Luke nodded slightly. "It was a long time ago. But there ain't a day I don't see her in this house. Hear her laugh in the quiet." He looked up then, meeting Clara's gaze. "You remind me of her sometimes. Not in looks, in spirit." She had that same way of keeping going when the world said you shouldn't. The words lodged in Clara's throat. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Instead, she reached for another log and placed it on the fire, the sparks rising between them like fragile stars. Luke didn't speak again, but the silence that followed was not heavy. It felt like something understood, an unspoken bridge between two hearts that had known loss and yet refused to stop beating. After that night, their days took on a rhythm, quiet but full. Luke rode out early each morning to check the cattle while Clara tended to Samuel and kept the house running. When the chores were done, she'd step outside with the baby in her arms, standing at the fence line to watch him work. He moved through the snow with an ease that spoke of years spent taming the land. Sometimes, when he caught her watching, he'd tip his hat, that faint, rare smile tugging at his mouth. It was enough to warm her more than the fire ever could. By late February, the first signs of spring crept into the air, not much. Just the way the sun lingered a little longer each evening and the snow began to glisten with melt. One morning, Luke came in carrying a bundle of wood and found Clara singing softly to Samuel. The tune was a lullaby her mother used to hum, one she hadn't dared to sing since Thomas died. The sound filled the room with something so gentle that Luke stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "That's a fine song," he said finally. Clara flushed, embarrassed. "Just an old one. My mother used to say babies sleep better if the song's older than their mother." Luke smiled faintly. "Maybe that's true." He set the wood down, then hesitated before speaking again. "You sing like you've carried sorrow, but you don't let it break you." Clara looked up. "You speak like a man who knows the difference." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the kind of gaze that says more than words dare. Then Samuel stirred, and the spell broke. Luke cleared his throat, mumbling something about fixing the barn roof before the thaw. But as he stepped outside, Clara saw a different light in his eyes, not pity, not loneliness. Something gentler, something almost hopeful. The weeks that followed carried a quiet tenderness neither spoke of. He brought her small gifts without reason, a polished horseshoe for luck, a book of poetry found in town. She mended his shirts with care, her stitches neater each time. Sometimes they'd share supper in comfortable silence, the fire throwing soft gold across their faces. When Samuel giggled, Luke would smile in a way that reached his eyes, and Clara's heart would flutter in her chest, surprised by how alive it felt again. One evening, after the first true thaw, Luke asked if she'd walk with him to the ridge behind the house. The snow had melted enough to reveal patches of brown grass, and the air smelled faintly of earth and pine. They stood side by side, looking out over the valley. The river below ran fast with meltwater, glinting like silver. "This land," Luke said quietly, "it can be cruel. But when spring comes, it always feels like a promise kept." Clara nodded, eyes on the horizon. "I used to think life ended when Thomas died. But now, looking out there, it feels like it just changed its shape." Luke turned toward her then, the setting sun catching in his hair. "You're stronger than you think, Clara." She met his gaze, and for the first time she didn't look away. The air between them hummed with something new, something alive. Luke's hand twitched at his side, as though fighting the urge to reach for hers. In another life, in another time, maybe he would have. But for now, they stood quietly, two souls bound by loss, slowly learning how to live again. When they walked back to the house, the first snow-melt rain began to fall, soft, cold, and full of promise. By late March, the world around Red Willow Ranch had begun to thaw into life again. The snow retreated from the hills like a tide going out, leaving behind patches of tender green. Streams broke free of their icy prisons, rushing bright and loud through the valley. The air was crisp but kinder now, and every morning Clara woke to the songs of meadowlarks echoing over the plains. She'd come to love the rhythm of the ranch, the honest labor, the smell of earth and hay, the way the days felt stitched together by small acts of care. Luke's quiet steadiness had become the anchor she didn't know she needed. He never treated her as fragile or helpless. When she offered to help mend a fence or carry feed, he didn't argue, only smiled that soft, knowing smile and handed her gloves. "Reckon 2 hands are better than 1, he'd say, and together they'd work beneath the wide Wyoming sky until dusk fell gold across the land. But spring wasn't all gentleness. With the thaw came trouble, the kind that tests the bones of a ranch. One morning, Luke rode out before sunrise and didn't return by noon. Clara tried to busy herself, feeding Samuel, sweeping, hanging linens in the soft breeze, but unease gnawed at her. When the sun began to dip low and still there was no sign of him, she saddled Mercy, the chestnut mare, and rode out toward the northern pasture. The trail was muddy, the river swollen with meltwater. She followed it for over a mile before she saw him, Luke, standing knee-deep in the creek, straining against a section of collapsed fence. One of the cattle had slipped through and gotten itself stuck in the current. Bawling in panic as the icy water surged around it, without hesitation, Clara spurred the horse forward. "Luke," she called, her voice sharp against the wind. He turned, eyes widening in surprise. "Clara, get back. The current's too strong." But she was already off the horse, splashing into the freezing water. The shock of it stole her breath, but she forced her legs to move. Together they reached the terrified steer, guiding it toward the bank. Luke braced himself against the mud, muscles straining, and Clara pressed her shoulder to the animal's flank, murmuring softly. After what felt like an eternity, the steer scrambled onto solid ground, collapsing with a heavy snort. Luke staggered after it, drenched and breathing hard. Clara followed, trembling from the cold but laughing through her gasps. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice rough, "and let you drown out here alone?" She shot back, her teeth chattering. Luke stared at her for a long moment, the corner of his mouth twitching despite himself. "You're a stubborn woman, Clara Dawson." She met his gaze, shivering. "So I've been told." He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders before she could protest. It smelled of pine and smoke and him. "Let's get you home," he murmured by the time they reached the ranch. The sky had turned gray with another brewing storm. Clara's fingers were numb and Luke's lips were pale from the cold. Inside, he built the fire high and insisted she sit close while he fetched blankets. She tried to protest that he was just as soaked, but he silenced her with a look, the kind that said arguing would do no good. When he returned, he wrapped a blanket around them both, drawing her near so their shoulders touched. For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the pop of the fire and the wind sighing against the windows. "You could have been swept away," Luke said finally. His voice low, almost rough. Clara looked up at him, her face soft in the firelight. "So could you." His hand twitched where it rested on the blanket. "I've spent so long trying not to lose what's left of this place," he said. "Didn't think I'd have to worry about losing someone else, too." The words hung between them, trembling like the space before lightning. Clara's heart pounded. "Luke!" She whispered, but she couldn't find the rest. He turned toward her then, eyes bright and unguarded. For a heartbeat, she saw everything he'd kept hidden, the loneliness, the fear, the quiet longing. Then, slowly, as though afraid the moment might break, he reached out and brushed a strand of damp hair from her face. "You've brought more life into this house than I ever thought it'd hold again," he said softly. "You and that little one. It's like spring came early this year." Tears stung her eyes before she could stop them. "You've given us a home when no one else would," she said. "You saved us, Luke." He shook his head, a faint smile curving his lips. "Reckon you saved me right back." The firelight flickered between them, painting gold across his face. Clara's breath caught as his hand lingered near her cheek. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and part of her wanted him to. But instead, he pulled back, his expression gentle, almost reverent. "You should rest," he murmured. "Storm's coming in again. We'll need our strength come morning." She nodded, though her heart ached with the words left unsaid. As she rose to check on Samuel, Luke watched her go, his jaw tight as though holding back something too tender to name. The next day, the storm hit hard, a sudden furious burst of late snow that blanketed the valley once more. Fences vanished beneath drifts, and the wind howled through the trees like a choir of ghosts. But inside the ranch house, there was warmth and light. Clara baked bread while Luke chopped wood, and Samuel babbled happily in his cradle. The storm raged for 3 days, but neither of them minded. It felt almost like the world outside had faded away, leaving only them, two souls finding quiet refuge in each other's company. On the third night, when the wind finally died and the fire burned low, Clara stood at the window watching the flakes drift softly in the moonlight. Luke joined her, his shoulder brushing hers. "Snow's beautiful when you ain't fighting it," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "It is." They stood there together in the hush, the world outside glowing white and still. For the first time since she'd buried Thomas, Clara didn't feel haunted by the past. She felt present, alive, and when she turned to Luke, the warmth in his eyes told her he felt it too. By late November, the valley had turned quiet again beneath a sky the color of pewter. The air carried that particular stillness that comes before snow, and the smell of wood smoke drifted from the ranch chimney like a gentle promise of warmth. Clara stood by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching the pale breath of winter crawl across the fields. Samuel, now nearly a year old, slept soundly in the cradle by the hearth, his soft curls catching the glow of the fire. The days had grown shorter, the nights longer, but her heart no longer felt heavy when darkness came. Life at Red Willow Ranch had become steady and full, marked by small joys, laughter over supper, quiet moments shared while mending fence posts, Luke's easy voice humming some old tune while he worked, yet there was something between them still unspoken. A warmth that had grown all through the summer and fall, quiet as roots beneath the soil. She felt it in the brush of his hand when he passed her a tool, in the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long, in how her chest fluttered whenever his voice softened around her name. Sometimes she thought he might say it, that one simple truth they both felt, but each time he'd swallow the words like a man afraid to disturb something sacred. And she was just as guilty. After all the loss and grief, she didn't know how to believe in love again. But oh, how she wanted to. That afternoon, clouds rolled in heavy and gray. By dusk, the first flakes began to fall, soft, slow, silent. Clara stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl close. The world outside had turned into a dreamscape, snowflakes spinning lazily through the air, landing on her hair, her lashes. The chill kissed her skin, but she didn't mind. It felt like the earth itself was exhaling, letting go. Behind her, the door opened with a soft creak. Didn't figure you'd be out in this. Luke's voice rumbled gently, warm as the firelight spilling through the doorway. She turned, smiling faintly. You forget, Mr. Bennett, I've survived worse than snow. He stepped onto the porch beside her, his boots crunching softly against the wood. That you have. He looked out over the pasture, where the white had begun to blur the horizon. Snow always feels like a clean slate to me. Covers what's come before, gives you a chance to start again. Clara followed his gaze, her voice soft. Maybe that's what we've both been doing. Starting again. Luke's breath misted in the cold, his profile lit by the golden glow from the house behind them. You've brought life back into this place, Clara. I didn't know how quiet it was until you came. Her heart fluttered. She looked up at him, snow catching in her hair. And you gave me somewhere to belong, when I had nowhere. He met her eyes then, and for a moment, the world around them disappeared. The falling snow, the cold, the distance, it all faded until there was only that space between them, alive and trembling. Clara. He began, his voice low and uncertain, as though the words themselves were fragile. I've tried to keep this to myself. Thought maybe it was wrong. Maybe you needed time or peace. But I can't stand beside you one more day and pretend I don't. He stopped, took a breath, and started again, steadier this time. I love you. The words hung in the air, soft but solid as snowfall. Clara's lips parted, her pulse quickening. For a heartbeat, she couldn't speak. Her throat ached with the weight of everything that had led here, the loss, the fear, the long road that had brought her to this porch under the winter sky. She set down her cup, her fingers trembling. Luke, she whispered. I didn't think I'd ever hear those words again, or that I'd want to. But, she stepped closer, her voice catching. You've given me more than I ever dared to hope for. You've shown me kindness when the world turned its back. You've made me believe there's still good left, still love left. The wind stirred around them, swirling the snow into a soft dance. Luke's eyes shone, not with sadness this time, but with something fierce and bright. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing her cheek. Say it, Clara, he murmured, barely more than a breath. She smiled then, a small, trembling thing full of light. I love you too, Luke Bennett, with all that's left of me, and all that's come back to life. The distance between them vanished. He drew her close, slow and careful, as though afraid she might fade like a dream. His hand slipped to the small of her back, hers to his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heart. The snow fell thicker now, dusting their shoulders, melting where it touched their warmth. And there, under the endless Wyoming sky, Luke bent his head and kissed her. It wasn't the desperate kiss of hunger or longing. It was something deeper, quieter, like a promise sealed in winter. The kind of kiss that said, "You are safe. You are home." When they finally pulled apart, Clara's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with tears that weren't from sorrow. Luke brushed a thumb over her lips, smiling in that quiet way of his. "Guess I finally found my peace," he said softly. Clara leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "And I found mine." Behind them, the ranch windows glowed warm, Samuel sleeping soundly by the fire. The wind sighed through the pines, the snow whispering across the fields like the world itself blessing them. Luke tightened his arm around her, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Come inside, love," he murmured. "Let's start our first winter together right." She smiled, taking his hand. "Yes, Luke, let's." They stepped back through the door, into the light and warmth of their home, leaving footprints in the snow that would soon vanish beneath the steady fall. But the mark they'd left on each other's hearts would never fade. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless, not an ending at all, but the quiet beginning of everything new.